The first thing I noticed wasn't the flashing red and blue lights. It was the smug little smirk on Karen's face as she stood in my driveway at 6 in the morning, flanked by two confused police officers. I was still in my bathrobe, steam curling from my coffee mug, when she crossed her arms and said, "Mr. Martinez, you've violated HOA rules, and I've called the authorities to deal with it." Her voice dripped with false sweetness, but her eyes were cold, calculating. Behind her, the sun was barely over the rooftops, bathing the quiet street in gold. My neighbor's blinds twitched. Everyone loves a little drama, especially when it's not theirs. The smell of my fresh coffee mingled with Karen's overpowering vanilla perfume, and I realized this wasn't just about pool rules anymore. This was war. What Karen didn't know was that by calling the cops on me, she'd just handed me the match I needed to burn her entire little empire to the ground. If you enjoyed that moment, you're going to love what's coming next. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss a single HOA showdown, community drama, or David vs. Goliath story. Your next favorite tale might just drop tomorrow. The first sign of trouble came on a breezy Saturday afternoon in late June. I was in my backyard sanding down the deck rails. Miguel was at the community pool with a couple of his friends, and life in our quiet corner of Willow Bend Meadows was, at least for the moment, calm. My wife Sarah had passed away 3 years ago, and in that time, I'd slowly built a rhythm that kept me sane. Woodworking, gardening, and spending time with my nephew. The HOA rarely crossed my mind anymore, until that day. I heard the raised voices before I saw the scene. The pool is 2 blocks from my house, and the sound carries on summer days. But this wasn't the usual chatter of kids splashing around. This was sharp, cutting, and accusatory. My neighbor Janet came hustling up the sidewalk, a mixture of shock and gossip lighting up her face. "You better get down there, Dave," she said, barely stopping to breathe. "Karen's going off on Miguel, something about pool rules, but she's calling the cops." At first, I thought she was exaggerating. Karen Hughes, the HOA president for the last 5 years, was notorious for nitpicking over trash cans and mailbox paint, but calling the police over a kid swimming? That seemed like a step too far, even for her. Still, I put down the sander and started walking toward the pool. By the time I arrived, the scene could have been ripped straight from a bad daytime reality show. Miguel was sitting on a lounge chair, shivering slightly under a blue and white striped towel. Karen stood in front of him, a clipboard in one hand, and her finger stabbing the air like she was delivering closing arguments in a trial. Behind her, 2 police officers stood in rigid silence, their expressions somewhere between bored and mildly uncomfortable. "Your name is not on the authorized guest list for this facility," Karen barked. "That is a violation of HOA Regulation 14B, subsection 3. Pool access is revoked immediately, and since you refused my direct instruction to leave, I am within my authority to have you removed by law enforcement." Miguel glanced up at me with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. "Uncle Dave," he muttered, "I just came to swim. I used my key card. She said it was expired, but it worked." I stepped between them, my eyes locking on Karen's. "You called the police? Over a pool key card?" Her mouth twitched in a self-satisfied smile. "Rules are rules, Mr. Martinez. This community maintains high standards, and I will not tolerate unauthorized use of amenities. We have liability to consider." "Liability?" I repeated. "He's my nephew. He's covered under my household membership. And unless the HOA charter has magically rewritten itself in the last week, nothing here says you can override access without a board vote." Karen's eyes narrowed. She loved control, and in moments like this, it wasn't about the pool. It was about reminding everyone who ran things around here. "You're welcome to take it up with the board at the next meeting," she said, though we both knew the board was just her and 2 friends who voted however she told them to. One of the officers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, there's no criminal matter here. If this is a civil dispute, you might want to resolve it without our involvement." Karen's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "Officer, this young man was trespassing." "No," I cut in. "He was swimming, in a pool his family pays for, and now you're harassing him in front of half the neighborhood." I turned to Miguel. "Get your stuff, buddy. We're leaving." As we walked out, I caught whispers rippling through the small crowd that had gathered. People were tired of her antics. Some had been victims themselves, and as much as I wanted to just take Miguel home and shake this off, Something in me into place. It wasn't about the pool anymore. It was about power, abuse of it, and the fact that Karen had called the police over nothing told me one thing. She'd gotten far too comfortable throwing her weight around. I didn't know it yet, but that afternoon would be the spark for a war that would drag every skeleton in our HOA's closet into the daylight. And I was more than ready to dig. The next morning, I woke up to an HOA incident report shoved into my mailbox, sealed in an official-looking envelope stamped urgent, board action required in big red letters. I didn't even need to open it to know whose fingerprints were all over it. Karen had likely typed it up the second she got home, probably still fuming that the police hadn't hauled Miguel off in handcuffs. Sure enough, when I unfolded the letter, it was a masterpiece of inflated drama. On June 24th, unauthorized entry into the community pool facility was committed by an unregistered minor, creating a safety hazard and liability risk for the association. When directed to vacate the premises, the adult guardian became verbally confrontational, obstructing HOA enforcement procedures. In the margin, in Karen's neat, self-important handwriting, she'd scrawled, "Recommend fines for both pool misuse and disruption of HOA authority. We'll discuss at emergency meeting." Emergency meeting? Over swimming? The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so telling. Karen wasn't just looking to punish Miguel, she wanted to make an example out of both of us. That was her pattern. Anyone who challenged her, no matter how small the issue, ended up targeted until they either backed down or sold their house. I'd lived in Willow Bend Meadows for 12 years. I'd seen her chase out a retired couple over lawn ornament violations, and once even threatened to put a lien on a single mom's home because her garage door was painted the double wrong shade of beige. Most people caved to avoid the headache. I wasn't most people. The emergency meeting was set for Tuesday night. That gave me 3 days. 3 days to dig into HOA bylaws, meeting minutes, and if I was lucky, a few of the financial records I'd heard whispers about. I wasn't a lawyer anymore, but I'd spent 20 years practicing contract law, and if Karen thought she could steamroll me the same way she did everyone else, she was about to learn how wrong she was. I started by emailing the HOA's management company, formally requesting access to the last 5 years of financial statements and board meeting minutes. Texas law was on my side. HOAs have to make these records available to members on request. I copied the entire board on the email, just to make it public from the start. By noon, I got a reply, not from the management company, but from Karen herself. "Mr. Martinez, your request for financial records has been denied until you settle all outstanding fines and penalties associated with the June 24th incident. You may address the board directly on Tuesday night to appeal this decision." I had to laugh. She'd just handed me my first piece of ammunition, denying a records request without legal grounds. That was a violation big enough to draw state oversight, and if she'd put something like that in writing once, I'd bet this wasn't her first time playing gatekeeper with the books. That afternoon, I started making calls, first to Janet, who'd been at the pool that day, then to Tom, a neighbor who'd once run for the board before mysteriously withdrawing his candidacy. Both had stories, ugly ones. Janet told me about a $50,000 landscaping project from 2 summers ago that had never materialized. No new plants, no fresh mulch, nothing. Tom said he'd been warned, flat out, that if he ran for the board, Karen would find a reason to fine him, until he dropped out. By Sunday evening, my dining table looked like a crime investigation scene. Printouts, sticky notes, and highlighters everywhere. Miguel sat across from me doing his summer reading assignment, occasionally glancing up. "You're really going after her, huh?" he asked. I leaned back in my chair. "She thinks she can bully everyone here. And maybe she could have kept doing it, if she hadn't messed with you." His grin was small, but fierce. Good. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about proving Karen wrong. It was about showing the whole neighborhood that they didn't have to live under her thumb anymore. Tuesday couldn't come soon enough. Tuesday night, the clubhouse parking lot was packed, more cars than I'd seen since last year's 4th of July barbecue. Word had spread about the emergency meeting, and curiosity had drawn even the residents who normally kept their heads down. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Karen sat at the head of the long conference table, dressed in the same shade of power red as she'd worn at the pool. Her clipboard was stacked with papers, and a microphone sat in front of her like she was chairing a Senate hearing. Two other board members flanked her, both looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I took a seat in the second row. Miguel was at home. This wasn't a place for him tonight. Around me, neighbors murmured to each other, their eyes darting between Karen and me. Karen opened with her usual syrupy voice, the kind she used when she wanted to sound professional. Good evening, everyone. We are here tonight to address a serious violation of our community's rules. This matter concerns unauthorized use of the pool facility, as well as a disruptive confrontation that occurred when HOA enforcement attempted to address it. Enforcement? She'd really called herself that? She gestured toward the projector screen behind her, which now displayed a grainy still from the pool's security camera. Me sitting poolside, Miguel wrapped in a towel, and Karen pointing like she was conducting an exorcism. I heard a few chuckles in the room. That didn't seem to please her. Karen continued, "We have a duty to maintain safety, order, and respect for HOA authority. Failure to do so puts the community at risk, legally and financially. This is why the board will be voting tonight on whether to impose fines for this violation." When she finally opened the floor for comments, I stood. "Before we start talking about fines, I have a procedural question," I said, keeping my tone calm. "When exactly did the board approve tonight's meeting?" Karen's smile thinned. "The bylaws allow the president, myself, to call an emergency meeting at her discretion." "Correct," I said, holding up a printed copy of those same bylaws. "They also require that the agenda be posted to all members at least 72 hours in advance, except in cases of imminent safety threats." What was the imminent threat here? Chlorine shortage? Dangerous levels of fun? That got a few outright laughs. Karen's eyes narrowed. "The agenda was posted," she said curtly. "Actually, no. I checked every community bulletin board and the HOA website archive. There's no posting for tonight's meeting until 24 hours ago. That's a violation of our own governing documents." Murmurs swept through the room. One of the board members shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable. "And while we're on the topic of violations," I continued, "Texas law requires HOAs to provide financial records to members upon request. I made such a request 3 days ago and received a denial from you personally. That's also a violation of state law." Now the murmurs turned into a low buzz. People were looking at Karen differently. Her voice hardened. "Mr. Martinez, this is no on the time or place." "Oh, it's exactly the time and place," I interrupted. "Because if we're talking about rule enforcement, maybe we should start with the rules this board has been breaking." I pulled a folder from my bag and set it on the table in front of me with a satisfying thud. "And I've brought documentation, financial discrepancies, missing receipts, and more than one questionable payment to preferred vendors that don't seem to exist." Gasps rippled through the audience. Karen's knuckles whitened around her pen. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't look like she was in control. Karen tried to recover, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. "Mr. Martinez, you're making some serious accusations without context. The board manages complex finances. Mistakes happen, but there's no wrongdoing here." I didn't flinch. "That's why I requested the records, to give context. But you refused, which makes it look less like a mistake and more like you don't want anyone seeing the numbers." One of the other board members, a wiry man in a polo shirt whose name tag read Tom Harkins, Treasurer, cleared his throat. "Karen, maybe we should consider letting him review the documents, just to put this to bed." Karen shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Tom, we don't air laundry in public." I stepped closer to the table, keeping my voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This isn't laundry, Karen. It's the community's money, and if there's nothing to hide, then transparency shouldn't be a problem." A woman in the back row spoke up. "He's right. I've been asking about last year's landscaping budget for months. Nobody ever answers." Another man added, "And what about the pool heater? We were told it cost $12,000, but my brother installs those for half that price." The room was coming alive now. Not with the polite nods Karen usually commanded, but with frustration. Real questions. Karen's voice cracked slightly as she tried to wrestle control back. Everyone, please, this meeting is about Mr. Martinez's violation. Let's not get sidetracked. I smiled, not a gloating smile, but the kind that says you're losing the room. See, that's the thing. You wanted to make this meeting about me, but it's not. It's about how you've been running this HOA like your own private bank account. I opened my folder and slid a document across the table toward her. Here's one example. $8,400 paid to Mitchell Consulting LLC for event coordination last December. Funny thing, Mitchell Consulting LLC was dissolved in 2017, and the address listed on the invoice? It's your home. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Karen's face flushed pink, then red. That's completely legitimate, she stammered. Brad, my husband, handled the event planning as a personal favor to the community. Tom, the treasurer, frowned. Karen, I didn't authorize that payment. The board didn't approve it either. Now every pair of eyes in the room was on her. She looked small for the first time since I'd met her, her perfect posture sagging just a little. You want to talk about pool passes? I said quietly. Fine. But first, let's talk about the $42,000 in vendor fees that went to companies that don't exist in the state registry. That was the breaking point. Voices rose all around us. Questions, demands, calls for an audit. Karen's gavel slammed against the table, but it only fueled the noise. And in that moment, I knew the battle had just shifted from defending myself to dismantling her entire operation. The meeting ended in chaos. Karen stormed out, clutching her leather planner like it was a life raft, with two of her loyalists trailing behind. The rest of the residents didn't leave. They clustered in small groups, talking in low but urgent voices, passing my printed documents between them like contraband. Tom Harkins, the treasurer, approached me near the coffee urn. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "You're not wrong, Martinez," he said, voice low. "I've been uncomfortable with some of the spending for a while, but every time I asked questions, Karen shut me out. She controls the agenda, the meeting minutes, everything." "Then you've seen the invoices?" I asked. "Bits and pieces," he admitted. "Never the full ledger. She keeps that on her personal laptop." That was gold. In my line of work, possession of the original records meant leverage, and in Karen's case, probably motive to hide them. "I'll need you to back me when I file for a full records request," I said. "The state law is on our side." Tom nodded reluctantly. "I'll think about it." He slipped away before anyone noticed we were talking. Outside, Maria was waiting by my car, arms crossed. "Well, you certainly know how to start a fire," she said with a grin. "Half this neighborhood will be buzzing about you before dinner." "That's the point," I said. "If we keep this quiet, she wins. If we keep it public, she slips." Maria's expression turned serious. "You don't understand how deep she's in. The landscaping company? Her brother-in-law runs it. Pool maintenance? Her cousin. Snow removal? Doesn't even own a plow. He subcontracts for half the rate and pockets the rest." I let out a low whistle. "That's textbook bid rigging." "Yeah," Maria said, "and it's been going on for at least 5 years. We've all been paying for it." That night, I spread the documents across my dining table like puzzy. Les pièces, payment ledgers, bank transfers, vendor lists, and a pattern started to emerge. The same handful of companies, all tied by family or personal connections to Karen, had been draining the HOA's accounts for years, and the amounts weren't small. This was hundreds of thousands of dollars over time. I sat back, the weight of it hitting me. This wasn't just about HOA politics anymore. This was financial fraud. The question was, how far was Karen willing to go to protect it? By midnight, my dining table looked like the war room of a small intelligence agency. Legal pads covered in scribbled notes, laptops open to spreadsheets and scanned PDFs, printed invoices laid side by side with bank statements, their matching dates and suspiciously round numbers practically screaming for attention. It was the kind of scene that, in my old life, I would have been paid a handsome hourly rate to create. But now, this was personal. The most obvious red flag was the landscaping contract. On paper, it looked legitimate. Weekly maintenance, seasonal flower rotations, snow removal in winter. But then I compared it to invoices from a reputable landscaping firm in the next neighborhood over. Same number of houses, similar square footage. Their contract cost was 38% lower. That's when I cross-checked the vendor address for our landscaping company. It wasn't a business office, it was a single-family home registered to Victor Ramirez. A quick online search confirmed what Maria had already hinted at. Victor was Karen's brother-in-law. And that was just the beginning. The pool maintenance contract was even worse. We were paying nearly double the going rate, with vague line items like emergency chemical stabilization, billed 4 or 5 times a summer. I'd seen enough pool contracts in my career to know that was nonsense. No community pool needs emergency chemical stabilization unless you're dumping barrels of bleach in as a side hustle. That vendor, owned by Karen's cousin. The snow removal? That was a comedy of fraud. The invoices came from Frost Guard Solutions, a company with a shiny logo on its letterhead, but no registered business license. The subcontractor actually doing the work charged half of what Frost Guard billed us. That meant Frost Guard pocketed thousands every winter for doing nothing more than sending a middleman invoice. And guess whose nephew ran Frost Guard? I pushed my chair back and rubbed my temples. The sheer arrogance of it all was astounding. Karen hadn't even bothered to diversify her scam. It was all family and friends, and HOA turned into a personal ATM. Around 1 a.m., Maria texted me, "Got more for you. We'll drop by tomorrow." I barely slept. The next day, she arrived with a battered manila folder stuffed to bursting. "Tom came through," she said, shutting the door behind her. "Partial financial reports from the last 3 years. He says she doesn't know he copied them." We sat at the table side by side, flipping through the documents. The patterns were undeniable. Monthly overbilling, padded service charges, special assessment funds that were supposed to go toward playground repairs but instead vanished into a black hole of miscellaneous expenses. "This is the kind of evidence that makes prosecutors salivate," I said, tapping a page where 3 identical $7,500 transfers went to consulting services in the same week. "The problem is, we're missing the direct link to her personal accounts." Maria grinned. "Not for long." She slid another paper toward me, a printout of a Facebook post from Karen herself. In it, she was bragging about her new lake house getaway, complete with photos of her standing on the deck, wine glass in hand. The kicker? The post was dated the same week one of those $7,500 consulting payments cleared. "That's not proof," I said, but I could feel my pulse quickening. "But it's the kind of circumstantial evidence that makes juries raise their eyebrows." That night, I began structuring the case like I'd done 100 times before. Fraud schemes lived and died by 3 elements: pattern, motive, and opportunity. Karen had all 3 in spades. The pattern was her network of overbilled family-run contracts. The motive was financial gain, obvious from her sudden jump in lifestyle. The opportunity came from her chokehold on the HOA board and its records. The only thing left was timing. Expose her too soon, and she'd lock everything down. Wait too long, and she might drain the accounts dry. Maria, ever the pragmatist, leaned over the table and whispered, "So, when do we light the fuse?" I didn't answer right away. I glanced at the growing mountain of evidence between us, the financial records, the vendor connections, the smug Facebook posts, and I knew the answer wasn't if we'd go after her. It was how big the explosion would be when we did. Karen thought her power came from fear. She was about to learn what happens when fear flips into fury, and I was going to make sure she learned that lesson in front of the entire neighborhood. The fuse got its spark sooner than I expected. 2 mornings later, I was sipping my coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Maria, her voice low but urgent. "She's moving money," she said. "Tom just overheard her telling Victor to clear the accounts before things get messy." That was it. Our window had opened, and I wasn't about to let it slam shut. By noon, I had contacted Detective Angela Chen, an old acquaintance from my legal days who specialized in financial crimes. I laid it all out for her: the overbilling, the family contracts, the phantom consulting fees. Her tone was calm but razor sharp. "If you can get me clean copies of those documents, unaltered with metadata intact, I can start the process. But Dave, if..." She suspects we're looking into her. She'll vanish. I assured her that Maria and I had been careful, but Chen's warning rattled me. Karen's smug tennis court smile wasn't just HOA power tripping. It was the confidence of someone who thought she was untouchable. That afternoon, Maria and I made a quiet run to the county records office. We pulled every vendor contract the HOA had filed in the last 5 years. Most were identical boilerplate templates with only the names swapped out, a lazy criminal's mistake. When I matched them against our spreadsheets, I saw the scam in plain daylight: identical service descriptions, carbon-copied timelines, but wildly inflated costs. I didn't just see fraud, I saw the exact number of dollars she'd siphoned from our community: $847,000 over 3 years. Enough to make your blood boil. Time to put her in check, I said, tucking the files into my briefcase. But this wasn't going to be some private sting. I wanted the neighborhood to see exactly who had been draining their wallets. So I devised a plan that was part legal maneuver, part theater. Step 1. Call an emergency HOA meeting under the guise of budget restructuring. I used the HOA bylaws themselves, ironically drafted by Karen, to force her into attendance. Step 2. Have Detective Chen waiting in the wings, ready to act the moment the evidence was made public. Step 3. Hit her with the reveal in front of every resident, so her usual tactic of twisting the truth with whisper campaigns wouldn't stand a chance. The meeting was set for Friday evening. The community center was already buzzing when I arrived, the air thick with curiosity. Karen was seated at the front, binder in hand, her expression a mixture of irritation and boredom. She didn't yet know she was about to star in her own public downfall. I began by reviewing the budget on a projector screen. Normal line items, modest expenses. Then, casually, I flipped to a slide labeled Questionable Disbursements. One by one, I walked through the vendor contracts, the family connections, the inflated costs. Murmurs grew into gasps. When I clicked to the slide with her lake house photo next to the $7,500 consulting payment, the room went dead silent. Karen's face flushed crimson. "This is slander," she hissed. "You can't prove anything." That was my cue. "Actually," I said, sliding a thick folder across the table toward her, "we can. And so can the state's Financial Crimes Division." The door opened, and Detective Chen stepped inside. Every eye in the room followed her as she introduced herself and began reading Karen her rights. The sight of Karen being escorted out, still clutching her precious binder, was met with a stunned hush, then a slow ripple of applause. We weren't just getting justice, we were taking our community back. The echo of the community's applause was still bouncing off the cinder block walls when the door closed behind Karen. People were frozen in their seats, processing what had just happened. You could almost feel the collective weight lifting, years of intimidation, whispered threats, and passive-aggressive notices melting away in real time. Maria leaned toward me, her eyes wide. "You actually did it," she whispered. But I wasn't ready to celebrate. Not yet. Taking Karen off the board was only the first move. We still had to secure the evidence, freeze the accounts, and make sure her allies didn't swoop in to bury the mess. Chen was already 2 steps ahead. "Martinez, I'll need you at the station tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll go through your documentation and prepare formal charges. In the meantime, we've got a warrant to seize HOA financial records." That's when I saw him. Victor, the treasurer, hovering in the back of the room with his phone halfway out of his pocket. His pale, nervous face told me everything. He was the cleanup guy, the one who made sure paper trails vanished, and now he was deciding whether to run or hide. I locked eyes with Chen. "He's about to bolt." She turned on her heel, motioning for one of her officers to intercept. By the time Victor tried to slip out the side door, he had 2 detectives at his elbows. His phone was confiscated, his car searched, and just like that, Karen's number 2 was off the board. By the end of the night, the meeting had morphed into something unexpected, a rally. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now gathered in clusters, sharing their own horror stories about HOA overreach. Maria stood on a folding chair, calling for volunteers to form an interim board until elections could be held. The turnout shocked me. It wasn't just the usual handful of homeowners who cared about bylaws. It was families with key ideas, retirees, young couples, people who had given up on having a voice until now. As I packed my briefcase, one of the older residents, Mr. Riley, approached me. "You know, son," he said, gripping my shoulder, "this place used to be a real community before she took over. You brought it back tonight." His words hit harder than I expected. For months, I'd been driven by a mix of legal instinct and sheer stubbornness. But seeing my neighbors rally together reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. This wasn't just about catching a crook. It was about restoring trust. Still, I knew the fight wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to go quietly, and with her husband on the city council, there were bound to be strings she could still pull. The smart move now was to prepare for the counterattack before it landed. That night, I spread every document across my dining room table: bank statements, contracts, HOA meeting minutes. I created a timeline of every suspicious transaction, every manipulated vote, every fake invoice. By the time the sun came up, my wall looked like something out of a detective show. Photos, notes, red string tracing the money flow from our HOA dues straight into Karen's personal luxuries. It was airtight, and it was going to be the blueprint for dismantling her entire operation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was already planning her next move from a holding cell. I'd dealt with people like her before, people who thought the rules didn't apply to them. They didn't stop until someone made them. This time, that someone was going to be me. By the time I arrived at the station the next morning, Detective Chen had already pulled half the HOA's financial history from the seized files. Her desk looked like a paper avalanche had landed on it: binders, loose receipts, a small mountain of bank statements. The difference between her stacks and mine was that hers had official seizure tags, meaning they'd hold up in court. "Morning, Martinez," she said, not looking up from the monitor where she was scrolling through scanned checks. "Hope you brought coffee." I set the paper cup on her desk and slid into the chair beside her. I also brought the cross-reference list. Every dollar in and out of the HOA account for the last 3 years. I marked suspicious patterns in red. She took one glance at the spreadsheet and let out a low whistle. "You weren't kidding when you said airtight." She tapped a few keys, pulling up digital copies of the same checks I'd highlighted. There they were: payments to shell companies that didn't exist, consulting fees that lined up perfectly with Karen's known shopping trips, and, my personal favorite, an $8,900 equipment upgrade that turned out to be a custom outdoor kitchen in her backyard. The more we dug, the uglier it got. Victor's signature was on most of the fraudulent checks, but Karen's was always there as the co-signer. They'd built a perfect little echo chamber. Two signatures meant no single person could be blamed, and their allies on the board kept everyone else too scared to question it. At one point, Chen leaned back in her chair and said, "You realize this is going beyond HOA fraud. We're looking at tax evasion, wire fraud, maybe even racketeering if we can link the city councilman to it." My lips tightened. "Good. Let's make it stick." By noon, we'd outlined a preliminary case that was strong enough for the district attorney to greenlight charges. But before we popped up, Chen's phone buzzed. She answered, listened for a few seconds, then swiveled toward me. "That was the courthouse," she said. "Karen's out on bail. Someone posted it within the hour of her booking." "Let me guess," I said, already knowing the answer. "Her husband, and he's already calling in favors." The news didn't surprise me, but it did speed up the clock. If Brad Mitchell was leaning on his political connections, we'd have to get public opinion on our side before they tried to spin this as a misunderstanding. That night, Maria and I went live in the Willowbrook Community Facebook group. We didn't reveal confidential details, but we laid out the broad strokes: unexplained expenses, fraudulent invoices, and the fact that multiple residents' dues had been diverted to personal projects. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in. People sharing their own run-ins with Karen, former vendors coming forward to say they'd been pressured into inflating invoices, even a couple of ex-HOA board members offering to testify about intimidation tactics. But not all the responses were friendly. Within hours, a new anonymous account started posting that I was fabricating evidence and had a personal vendetta against Karen because she'd rejected me socially. It was such a weak smear that it almost made me laugh. Almost. I'd seen this tactic before: flood the community with doubt, hope the noise drowns out the truth. But this time, we had hard proof, and I wasn't going to let it get buried under gossip. Before logging off for the night, I pinned a post at the top of the group. Evidence speaks louder than rumors. It's coming. And I meant it. The next morning, the sun rose over Willowbrook like it always did. Soft gold spilling across the rooftops, dew clinging to the freshly cut grass. But something was different. There was a current running through the air, a quiet hum of anticipation that even the birds seemed to sense. Today wasn't just another day. Today was the day the curtain came down. Detective Chen had called me late the night before. The DA was ready to file charges, but she wanted one last clean piece of public confirmation before the political machine could muddy the waters. That meant releasing a curated set of the documents, enough to prove wrongdoing without compromising the prosecution. By 9 a.m., Maria and I were in the community hall, setting up a projector. Residents began trickling in, some cautious, some eager, all curious. I could see the unspoken question in their eyes. Is this really happening? When the last folding chair was filled, I stepped forward. For months, you've been told that our concerns about the HOA were unfounded. That questioning leadership was divisive. That transparency would somehow hurt this community. Today, you'll see for yourself what was really going on. One by one, I put the evidence on the screen. The bogus invoices, the shell companies, the checks signed by Karen and Victor, the before and after photos of Karen's backyard kitchen, paid for with our dues. Gasps rippled through the room. Then came the kicker, an internal email chain where Karen openly discussed making it impossible for certain troublemakers to access community amenities. My name was at the top of that list. When the lights came back up, the silence was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was the silence of a crowd deciding what came next. Then Mrs. Fletcher, the oldest resident in Willowbrook, stood up and said, "Enough is enough. I move to remove the entire board." The vote was unanimous. Even a few of Karen's former allies raised their hands. In that moment, the last of her power evaporated. By the afternoon, the DA's office had officially announced charges: embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and misuse of funds. News vans lined the street outside Karen's home, cameras catching the moment she was escorted out in handcuffs for the second and final time. This time, no bail was posted. Brad Mitchell's political career imploded within hours. Over the next few weeks, we rebuilt. The $420,000 recovered from the seized accounts was split. A portion went to refunding 3 years of HOA dues, another to real community improvements, a new playground, upgraded walking trails, and the repair of the pool that had started it all. The rest funded a scholarship for local students in Sarah's name, the first award going to Miguel. On the day of the pool's reopening, I sat at one of the shaded tables, coffee in hand, watching neighbors laugh, kids splash, and friends share food from the community potluck. For the first time since moving here, Willowbrook felt like the place I'd imagined when I bought my home. Miguel came over, dripping wet from a cannonball, and grinned. "Looks like you won, Uncle Dave." I smiled. "We all did, kid. We all did." The fight had started with a petty act of control, but it ended with a community reclaiming its voice and proving that no one, no matter how connected or intimidating, is untouchable when the truth comes to light. And as the sun set behind the pool, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, I realized something. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishing the guilty. It's about giving good people back the place they call home.